Hey now everybody, Jamie here, and there's a topic that came up on our Board Game Geek forums that I kind of want to talk about a little more. And it's something that it's interesting because there's two sides to this coin that don't seem specifically related, but to me, they're very related. And I think that a lot of other people out there feel the same way. The first half of it is Kickstarter. Everybody knows Kickstarter, the crowdfunding website. It's a huge part of the tabletop gaming world right now. You know, 5-6 years ago, tabletop gaming found it and started using it, and it's become a huge deal over the years. As a matter of fact, if you look at the statistics, games, now that includes video games as well, but games in general are the #1 money pulling in category in Kickstarter right now. And if you look at all the tabletop games, the large majority of them that have brought in all these millions of dollars are these gigantic extravaganza board games that have tons of miniatures in the box and all kinds of artwork and stretch goals for days. And they get millions and millions and millions of dollars. And inevitably, every time one of these comes out, I continually see comments and you know, people talking about how this is not good for the gaming world. They talk about how these companies put out these giant projects with all these miniatures, and then they're really just selling a bunch of miniatures. The games are shallow. All kinds of stuff is said like that. And I think it's silly. I think it's a silly concept to look at it in that capacity. A lot of people use the word money grab, and money grab is one of those trigger phrases for me because #1, first off, yes, everybody in business is trying to grab money. That's the point of being in business. Now, granted, a lot of people are in it for the passion and in it for the love of creating projects, and I respect that. But in the end, those companies need to make money, so they have to make decisions of how they're going to make that money, and they go for the things that make the most money. And that's not a bad thing at all. And now the reason this stuff bugs me is because you say these things, yet these projects are making so much money, millions and millions of dollars, and many of them have fantastic gameplay. Look at Kingdom Death Monster has such a depth of gameplay to that game, plus it has tons of miniatures in the box. And, you know, and then there's others like Massive Darkness, which is, you know, a simple, streamlined dungeon crawl game, which is fun, but it has tons of miniatures in the box. And the reason that I'm kind of bringing this up is because of this second half. So bear with me here. I am a role player. I do, you know, podcasts about board games, and we talk about miniatures games all the time. I've been doing Gaslands videos like crazy. But really, when it comes down to it, I identify myself as a role player. That's my favorite kind of game. I've played D&D since I was like 12 years old or 13 years old. And honestly, I don't think I can remember a period of time when I was not in some kind of D&D or role-playing campaign of some sort. I just revel in that style of gameplay. I love all the others, but that one I think is my favorite of all time. And when I started out in the 90s, we were playing Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. We started out, we never once would go into combat and put down a battle mat and put miniatures on that mat. We always played theater of the mind. The GM would describe the scene, and they would talk about the terrain, and they would talk about the monsters and what the monsters were wearing and what they had in their hands. And then the players would describe how they're going in to attack those monsters and the ways that they would move around combat. And it was all theater of the mind. Imagination was all of it. And I, very stupidly and silly concept in my mind, had that you know, I thought that's really a pure role-playing game. That's really the way you're supposed to play role-playing games. This battle mat crap is dumb. Like, I don't need a visual representation. I can imagine it. And that's just dumb. Because tactical miniatures combat is very much at the core of Dungeons & Dragons. It is a role-playing game and a tactical miniatures game together. And even way back to the beginning of time of Dungeons & Dragons in like 1970, when Gary Gygax designed Chainmail, it was a miniatures tactical war game that really had a lot of the similar mechanics. Now, granted, today we would not recognize many of them as the same, but back then it was the precursor to what Dungeons & Dragons really was. It was a tactical miniatures game with wizards and warriors and monsters. Gary Gygax in like 1970 at Gen Con, as a matter of fact, Gary Gygax founded Gen Con in like 1967, I think it was. Gen Con, the big convention that we all go to every year in Indianapolis, started in the 60s, and he met Dave Arneson. Dave Arneson was also a tactical miniatures game player and loved it and went to Gen Con. They met. They became friendly, and they decided that they were going to work together on these things. Dave presented to him his version of Chainmail a few years later that also had role-playing involved. Characters had names and personalities, and they would go into dungeons and fight monsters. So Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson got together to make this game. So the very first edition of Dungeons & Dragons was meant to have tactical miniatures combat in it, as well as roleplay and story and characters. And today, that's the way we play it. Not everybody plays it. And granted, like Theater of the Mind role-playing is fantastic. And there's many role-playing games out there that specifically target that kind of play. But Dungeons & Dragons itself is really a tactical miniatures game and a role-playing concept with it. It's like the two work together very well. Now, the way these two things marry together, if you bore with me at this point, is that these big Kickstarter projects are fantastic for me as a role player. Massive Darkness is one that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and Massive Darkness is probably the best one of all of them for this respect. When I said that I was a Theater of the Mind role player back in the day and I never bought miniatures, and one of the reasons I never bought miniatures was because I couldn't afford them, and it was very difficult to get them. Because when you go into a role-playing game, you need a whole bunch of the same dude. You know, when you would buy those old Dungeons & Dragons miniatures, first off, they were painted so bad it would make you want to vomit. And second, they were all droopy. The staves were drooping down and the swords were bent at the side. They were just garbage miniatures. But you would get them and you would never be able to get like 10 gnolls unless you went on a quest to get 10 gnolls so you could have a party of gnolls attack your players. And there were other options, like they had the Grenadier miniatures and all the different kinds of miniatures, but you always have to buy individually. I want 10 of those guys for a 10-man monster party to fight me. And it was difficult to do. Even to this day, even when you back a Reaper Bones Kickstarter, they don't give you quite enough to make the right size party. Massive Darkness gives you everything you need. Holy cow, when I got this box in the mail after backing this thing, I looked in there and I didn't even care if the game was fun or not, because I had all of this stuff for Dungeons & Dragons. I could not wait for my players to fight, you know, all of the troglodytes and the rat men and the lizard men, because I had plenty of them, and there were big ones and small ones and ones that were ranged and ones that were melee. It was just perfect. I had reps for all the different things I needed, and I had enough of them that I could really like put a force against my players. And not only that, it gives you a ton of heroes too. And if you have Zombicide, they all kind of like look the same and work the same. So you have all these heroes that you can bring into Dungeons and Dragons. Now, when I backed Massive Darkness, I wouldn't have backed it if I didn't think the game looked fun, because I think Massive Darkness looked fun when I backed it, but I might have passed it up if I wasn't a role player, you know? And I did ultimately like Massive Darkness when I played it. It's not the greatest dungeon crawl game ever, but it was fun. But I'll tell you, I got my money's worth hand over fist with this game because of the miniatures that came in the box. So why is it so terrible that I backed a project for a board game specifically because I wanted the miniatures? Well, it's not. Because honestly, at this point, with all of the boxes of miniatures that I have now, whenever something comes up in the game, somebody says, I need a flying sword comes out. I'm like, I got one. And I get up, I walk over to my shelf, I pull down something, I pull out the miniature. As a matter of fact, the flying sword was the Excalibur from Shadows over Camelot. And another guy had a flying axe. And that was, I think, the first player mark of the axe from Blood Rage. There's so many options now. I have miniatures for everything. Between Massive Darkness and Zombicide and Folklore of the Affliction and Conan and Mythic Battles Pantheon, I could play Dungeons and Dragons and never have a person fight the same monster twice for like a decade. And yeah, I spent a lot of money on that stuff, but I got great games beside, because all of those games I just mentioned are really fun games, and I enjoy them all. As a matter of fact, Conan and Mythic Battles Pantheon are just absolutely amazing tactical games, and Folklore of the Affliction is one of the best role-playing story games I've ever played. Tactical Miniatures is a little bit off on it. It's not really that fun when it gets to the combat, but the story is so immersive and great in that game. So I have all of these great games, and I have all of these Dungeons and Dragons miniatures. These projects are for so many different people, not just heavy board gamers, but for miniatures gamers and for role players to build their collection so that they can have all of these miniatures so they don't have to go on a quest to find 10 gnolls to put up against your players. I love this. I think it's great, and I think there's nothing wrong with these companies putting out this stuff because it serves a lot of different markets, and it shows in the amount of money that these things make. And they do a great job putting together some really cool sculpts too. So the next time you see one of these big miniatures game projects on Kickstarter, and if you're a role player, consider it, because I don't think you're going to find all of those miniatures in all of those different forms and all of those different parties of monsters that are going to be attacking you any other place for a price that inexpensive. And $120 or whatever it is a little expensive, but when you think about all the time you're saving and all of the stuff you're getting, I think there's a lot of savings there. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining me here on my little Kickstarter miniatures project and role-playing game mashup. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're looking for more board game, miniatures games, role-playing game content, you can check out our audio podcasts at thesecretcabal.com or on iTunes. And while you're here, do me a quick fave and subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and all that good stuff. And until next time, have a good one.